The hunger was a physical presence, a hollowed-out space carved just below her ribs. It had been 2 days since her last real meal, a half-eaten sandwich she'd found left on a park bench. Now, the November wind cut through her thin jacket, a constant reminder of the eviction notice, the locked apartment door, and the single, worn backpack that held everything she owned. Alara walked without a destination, her path dictated by the restaurants with the warmest light spilling onto the sidewalk. She watched people laugh over plates of food they wouldn't finish, leaving behind mountains of fries, entire halves of burgers. It was a special kind of torture. She saw him through the window of a small Italian cafe in the village. He was sitting alone at an outdoor table, shielded from the worst of the wind by a glass partition. He was immaculate in a charcoal wool suit that probably cost more than her entire year's tuition. A plate of pasta sat before him, rich with a dark red sauce, but he barely touched it. He took one bite, then another, before pushing the plate away with an air of finality. Her mind raced. The waiter wouldn't come for a few minutes. It was a window, a sliver of opportunity born of his disinterest and her desperation. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. She had $27 to her name. Pride wouldn't keep her warm tonight. She pushed through the wrought iron gate of the cafe's patio. Her worn sneakers made no sound on the stone. He didn't look up until she was standing beside his table. He was older than she'd thought, maybe late 30s, with dark hair cut short and eyes the color of black coffee. A faint, silver scar cut through his left eyebrow, the only imperfection on a face that seemed carved from stone. Her voice, when it came, was a dry rasp. "Excuse me." He finally lifted his gaze from the street, and his focus was so absolute it felt like a physical touch. He didn't seem annoyed or surprised. He simply waited. "I was wondering," she started, the words tasting like ash. "Can I eat what you didn't finish?" The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the clatter of silverware from other tables and the distant wail of a siren. He didn't look at her backpack or her frayed jeans or the exhaustion etched onto her face. He just looked at her, his expression unreadable. Most people would have recoiled or waved her away with disgust or pressed a few dollars into her hand and told her to move on. He did none of those things. Instead, he gestured with one long-fingered hand to the empty chair across from him. The hand was perfectly still, a heavy gold signet ring on his smallest finger the only ornament. "Sit," he said. The word was not a request. Alara's legs moved before her mind could protest. She sank into the chair, her body trembling slightly. He pushed the plate of pasta across the small table toward her. It was still warm. The scent of garlic and basil rose up, making her stomach clench with a painful, desperate cramp. She picked up the fork, her movements stiff. She didn't look at him as she took the first bite. The pasta was rich, the sauce complex and savory. It was the most incredible thing she had ever tasted. She ate quickly, methodically, trying not to look like the starving animal she was. But it was no use. She was too hungry to pretend. He watched her. She could feel his gaze on her, a steady, unnerving pressure. He didn't speak, didn't drink his water, didn't check his phone. He just watched her consume the meal he had rejected. When the plate was clean, she carefully set the fork down, the clink of metal against ceramic loud in the quiet space between them. She finally risked a glance at him. His face gave nothing away. "Thank you," she mumbled, her eyes on the table. She made a move to stand, to disappear back into the anonymity of the city. "What is your name?" he asked. His voice was low, a quiet rumble that carried easily over the noise of the street. "Alara." "Alara," he repeated, testing the sound of it. "Why are you asking strangers for their food?" Her chin lifted, a spark of her old pride igniting. "I was hungry." "I can see that," he said, his tone flat. "That is not what I asked." She didn't know this man her story. She didn't know him anything but a thank you for the food. She met his gaze directly. "It's none of your business." A flicker of something, not anger, maybe interest, crossed his features. He held her gaze for a long moment before he placed a few bills on the table and stood. The lean power in his movement was unmistakable. He adjusted his suit jacket. "Come with me." She remained seated, wary. "Why?" "You need more than one meal," he stated, as if it were the most obvious fact in the world. She thought he was offering to buy her groceries, or maybe take her to a shelter. The $27 in her pocket felt impossibly small. A real meal, a safe place for one night, was a temptation she couldn't resist. She stood and followed him. But they didn't walk toward a grocery store or a mission. They walked to the curb where a black sedan, so polished it reflected the gray sky, sat idling. The windows were tinted, impenetrable. A man in a dark suit got out of the driver's seat and opened the rear passenger door, his movements economical and precise. Alara stopped dead on the sidewalk. This was not charity. This was something else entirely. A cold knot of dread formed in her gut, even colder than the hunger had been. "Where are we going?" The man turned to face her. The streetlights were just beginning to flicker on, casting his face in shadow, but she could see the hard line of his jaw. The air of quiet authority he carried in the cafe had sharpened into something more menacing out here on the open street. "You asked for my help," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "This is what it looks like." It was a choice. She could turn and run, back to the certainty of a cold night on a subway grate, back to the gnawing hunger and the crushing weight of her failure. Or she could get into the car. She could trade the devil she knew for the one she most certainly did not. She looked at his unyielding face, at the open door of the silent, waiting car, and felt the last of her options withering away. She got in. The door closed behind her with a soft, heavy thud, sealing her inside. The scent of aged leather and something else, something clean and masculine like cedar, filled the small space. He slid in beside her, and the driver closed his door, plunging them into a shadowed, insulated world. The car pulled smoothly away from the curb, and Alara watched the cafe, the last piece of her old life, disappear behind them. She had made a choice, but she felt unmistakably like a prisoner. The car moved through the city with an unnerving smoothness, the chaos of Manhattan traffic parting before it. The man beside her said nothing. He simply stared out the window, his profile stark against the blur of city lights. Alara's mind was a frantic mess of questions. Who was he? What did he want? She had stumbled into a world she didn't understand, and every instinct screamed that it was a dangerous one. They arrived at a sleek, modern tower in Tribeca, a monument of glass and steel. The car descended into a private underground garage, and he led her to a private elevator that opened directly into a sprawling penthouse apartment. The entire place was a study in minimalist luxury. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a breathtaking panorama of the city skyline. The furniture was sparse, expensive, and impersonal. It looked less like a home and more like a beautifully curated cage. He walked to a wet bar and poured himself a drink. He didn't offer her one. "There are rules," he said, turning to face her, the glass of amber liquid held loosely in his hand. "You will stay here. The kitchen is stocked. There are clothes in the guest room closet. You will not leave this apartment without my permission. You will not speak to anyone who comes here unless I tell you to. Is that clear?" Alara stared at him, her throat tight. "For how long?" "For as long as I decide." He took a slow sip of his drink, his dark eyes never leaving her face. "My name is Dante." He said it as if it should mean something to her. It didn't, but the name, spoken in that room, carried a weight she could feel in her bones. In the days that followed, she began to understand why. Men came and went, all of them dressed in the same expensive, dark suits. They spoke to Dante in low, deferential tones, their eyes always slightly averted. They called him Mr. Moretti. They never acknowledged her presence beyond a fleeting, curious glance. She was a ghost in his castle, a piece of furniture he had acquired. She learned to be invisible. She ate the food that was silently restocked in the refrigerator each day. She wore the clothes, simple, elegant sweaters and pants in shades of gray and black, that had appeared in the closet. She spent her hours reading the books from his extensive library and staring out at the city that was so close, yet entirely out of reach. She was safe. She was warm. She was fed. And she had never felt more trapped. One evening, she found him in his study, a room she usually avoided. He was not working. He was staring at a small, framed photograph on his desk. She was about to retreat when he spoke, his voice quiet. "Come here." She hesitated, then walked slowly toward the desk. The photograph was of a young woman with Dante's dark eyes and a defiant smile. She looked full of life, a stark contrast to the cold stillness of the man beside her. "My sister," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Annalisa." Alara said nothing, waiting. "She was like you," he continued, his gaze fixed on the picture. "Too proud. She got into trouble, the kind of trouble you can't get out of alone. I offered her help. She told me it was none of my business." He paused, and the silence stretched. "She thought she could make it on her own. By the time she was ready to accept my help, it was too late." He didn't need to say what had happened. The finality in his tone was enough. Alara looked from the smiling woman in the photograph to the hard, unforgiving lines of Dante's face. He wasn't keeping her here out of kindness. He was keeping her here because her desperation, her pride, had reminded him of a failure he could never forgive himself for. She was a ghost he was trying to save, a penance for the one he had lost. A week later, an opportunity presented itself. A woman came to clean the apartment, a rare intrusion into their isolated world. As the woman left, Alara noticed she hadn't properly latched the service door near the kitchen. It was ajar, a dark slash of freedom in the pristine white wall. Dante was in his study on a call. The security guard in the hall would be changing shifts in 5 minutes. It was a chance, maybe her only one. She walked to the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her hand trembled as she reached for the cold metal handle. She could just walk out. She could take her chances on the street again. It would be hard, it would be cold, but it would be her own life. She thought about the hunger, the fear, the crushing loneliness of the last few weeks before she met him. Then she thought about the look in Dante's eyes when he spoke of his sister. It wasn't pity he felt for Alara. It was a raw, aching wound. She closed her eyes. The street was a known danger. This place, this man, was an unknown one. But for the first time in a long time, she was not hungry. She was not cold. She was, in a strange and unsettling way, protected. She pulled her hand back and gently pushed the door until it clicked shut. She turned and walked back into the vast, silent living room. Dante was standing there, his phone call finished. He was watching her, his expression unreadable. He had seen the open door. He had seen her choice. He said nothing. He didn't have to. In the quiet of the penthouse, with the city lights glittering like fallen stars below, a silent understanding passed between them. She had been given an exit, and she had refused it. Therefore, she was no longer just a stray he had taken in. She was here by choice. And that changed everything. The dynamic between them shifted after that day. The silence became less of a barrier and more of a shared space. He started asking her questions, not about her past or her poverty, but about her studies. She told him about her unfinished degree in sociology, her fascination with behavioral patterns and societal structures. He listened with an unnerving intensity, his sharp mind absorbing every detail. He would challenge her theories, offering his own brutally pragmatic view of human nature. Their conversations were a strange dance of academia and raw, street-level experience. He began to treat her less like a project and more like an equal, an intellect trapped by circumstance. One evening, while they were debating the principles of group loyalty, he used her name, and the way he said it was different. It was no longer just a label. It held a certain inflection, a quiet possessiveness that sent a shiver down her spine. It was the first, undeniable sign that his interest in her was becoming something more than a quest for absolution. This fragile new peace was shattered by a man named Gallo. He was one of Dante's rivals, a man whose ambition far outstripped his intelligence. From an apartment across the city, he watched Dante's penthouse through a high-powered scope. He saw the shadow of a woman on the balcony, saw her standing beside Dante Moretti. He made an assumption. She was Dante's new lover, a soft spot in his armor, a weakness to be exploited. Dante, perhaps sensing her growing restlessness, arranged for her to leave the apartment. It was a calculated risk. They were to visit a private gallery in Chelsea, surrounded by his men. It was meant to give her a breath of fresh air, a taste of a world beyond the penthouse walls. But Gallo had been watching. He saw the opportunity. As they exited the gallery and walked toward the waiting sedan, the attack came. It was brutally efficient. 2 cars screeched to a halt, boxing them in. Men with guns emerged. Alera's world dissolved into chaos and shouting. Before she could even process what was happening, Dante had moved. He shoved her behind him, his body a solid shield against the danger. He drew a weapon from inside his jacket with a speed that was terrifying. A gunshot cracked the air, deafeningly loud. In the ensuing pandemonium, Dante's focus was absolute. He never looked at the attackers. He only looked at her, his dark eyes blazing with a cold, lethal fire. His men moved with the same surgical precision, a choreographed dance of violence. It was over in less than a minute. 2 of Gallo's men lay on the pavement. The others were gone. Back in the silent, sterile safety of the penthouse, the adrenaline left her shaking. Dante had a long, shallow graze along his forearm, a red line against his white shirt. He ignored it. His fury was a palpable thing, a dangerous energy that filled the room. One of Gallo's men had been captured alive. He was brought to the apartment, to a large, empty room Alera had never seen before. She stayed in the living room, trying to block out the low, menacing tones of Dante's voice from the other room. After an hour, he emerged, his face like a thundercloud. He walked directly to her. "The man in there," he said, his voice tight with controlled rage. "He claims he was hired by a third party. He's lying." He mentioned a meeting place, a warehouse in Red Hook. Dante watched her, his eyes narrowed. "I talked to you about patterns. About desperation. You see it better than I do. What does a liar do when he's cornered?" She could have said she didn't know. She could have refused to be a part of it. It was his world, his violence. But she had seen the way he protected her. She had felt the solid wall of his body shielding her from a bullet. She thought about the man's story. He wouldn't invent a new lie, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. He would twist a truth. The warehouse is probably real. But the meeting isn't with a third party. It's with Gallo. He's telling you where Gallo will be, but he's trying to save his own skin by pretending he's not one of his men. Dante stared at her a long, searching look. Her analysis, cold and logical, hung in the air between them. It was a key. A piece of information that would undoubtedly seal the captured man's fate and direct Dante's retribution. By speaking, she had just loaded the gun and pointed him toward the target. She had crossed a line, stepping from observer to participant. He turned and walked back toward the room without a word. She knew, with chilling certainty, that her assessment had just signed a death warrant. Later that night, he found her by the windows, staring down at the city lights. The adrenaline was gone, replaced by a cold, heavy feeling in the pit of her stomach. "You didn't have to do that," he said, his voice quiet behind her. "I know," she replied, her gaze fixed on the endless grid of light and shadow below. He moved to stand beside her, so close she could feel the warmth radiating from him. The scent of cedar and something faintly metallic, like blood, clung to him. "You are not safe with me," he said. It wasn't an apology. It was a statement of fact. A confession of the price of his existence. She finally turned her head to look at him. His face was grim, the scar over his eye more pronounced in the dim light. "I haven't been safe for a long time," she said softly. The words were an admission, an acceptance. They both knew what they meant. But their confession had a consequence. Gallo now knew she wasn't just some woman. Her insight, her value to Dante had been proven. She was no longer just bait. She was a target. Gallo, enraged and humiliated by the failed abduction, made his next move a personal one. A package arrived at the building, addressed not to Dante Moretti, but to Alera. Inside was a single, dead white rose, a traditional symbol of death. It was a direct threat, a promise. The unspoken war had just become intensely personal. Dante's rage was a cold, controlled thing now, all his focus narrowing to a single point, the complete and utter eradication of Gallo. He began planning a response, a surgical strike on the Red Hook warehouse she had identified. His men gathered in the study, spreading out blueprints, discussing entry points and exit strategies. Alara stayed in the living room, but she could hear their low voices, the clinical discussion of violence. She remembered the captured man's desperate lies, the subtle tells in his body language. Dante was planning for a tactical confrontation with a rival, but Gallo wasn't a tactician. He was a creature of ego and wounded pride. A sudden, chilling thought struck her. The warehouse wasn't the real trap. It was too obvious. It was a distraction. Gallo wouldn't try to outfight Dante. He would try to humiliate him. The attack would come somewhere more personal, somewhere that symbolized Dante's history, his power. There was an old social club in Little Italy, his father's place, now rarely used but kept as a monument. It was a place of honor, a place Gallo would love to defile. She had to warn him, but walking into a war council of made men was impossible. She found Dante's underboss, a stern, older man named Sal, in the hallway. Her heart pounded, but her voice was level. "The warehouse," she said, keeping her voice low. "Gallo's not a strategist. He's vindictive. He won't hit Dante where he's strongest. He'll hit him where it hurts his pride." She looked Sal directly in the eye. His father's club. Sal's expression was stone, but his eyes flickered with consideration. He knew she had Dante's ear. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod and disappeared back into the study. She had done all she could. She had used her mind, her observations, not as an academic exercise, but as a weapon in a war she never wanted to join. Hours later, the penthouse was empty and silent. Dante and his men were gone. Alara paced the length of the vast apartment, the quiet pressing in on her. Every distant siren made her jump. Finally, just before dawn, she heard the elevator. Dante walked in, followed by Sal. He was bleeding. His left sleeve was soaked through with blood, and his face was pale with exhaustion and pain. But he was alive. Sal spoke quietly. She was right. They were waiting at the club. The warehouse was a skeleton crew. We walked into their trap, with our eyes open, thanks to her. They were ready for us, but we were ready for them. He looked at Dante. "You would have walked right into the main kill zone." Dante just nodded, dismissing him. He walked over to the bar and slumped into a chair, his body finally showing the strain. Alara rushed to the kitchen, grabbing the first aid kit. She returned and knelt before him, cutting away the ruined fabric of his shirt. The wound was a deep gash along his bicep, a bullet burn. It was ugly, but it wasn't fatal. If they had gone to the warehouse first, if they had walked into Gallo's primary ambush, it would have been so much worse. Her hands were steady as she cleaned the wound, her focus absolute. The clinical task grounded her, kept the fear at bay. He watched her, his expression unreadable, his breathing shallow. When she began to wrap the bandage, his right hand came up and covered hers, stilling her movements. His touch was surprisingly gentle. He looked at her then, and for the first time, the cold, calculating mask was gone. She saw the man beneath it, weary and vulnerable. "He targeted you to get to me," Dante said, his voice rough. "He made a mistake." He paused, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "You are not my weakness, Alara. You are my advantage." It wasn't a declaration of love. It was something more vital, more real. It was an acknowledgement, a statement of her place in this violent, unforgiving world he inhabited. In his world, that was everything. Weeks passed. The city was quiet again. The threat of Gallo had been permanently neutralized. The violent rhythm of Dante's life returned to its steady, quiet hum, but something had fundamentally changed. The space between them was no longer filled with rules and silence, but with an unspoken understanding. One evening, he approached her as she stood by the window, her customary spot. He didn't speak, just placed a small, single key on the marble windowsill beside her. "It's for an apartment," he said, his voice even. "A new one. Downtown, near the university. It's secure. Anything you need will be provided. You can re-enroll, finish your degree. You will be safe." It was an exit. A clean one. The life she had been mourning, the one she thought she wanted back. He was giving it to her, no strings attached. It was his version of a kindness, his way of setting things right. She looked at the small, silver key, the symbol of her freedom. She could walk away, back to a normal life, and pretend the last few months had been a fever dream. She could forget the scent of cedar and gunpowder, the weight of his gaze, the terrifying thrill of being seen not as a victim, but as a weapon. She looked up at him, at his dark, unreadable eyes. She saw the man who had taken her in, the man who had shielded her with his body, the man who called her his advantage. The normal world seemed pale and distant now, a life lived in black and white compared to the brutal, vivid color of his. Slowly she reached out, but she didn't pick up the key. Instead, she slid it back across the smooth, cold marble, pushing it toward him until it rested by his hand. "I don't think I'll be needing that," she said, her voice quiet but certain. He looked down at the key, then back at her. For a fleeting moment, the corner of his mouth lifted in the barest hint of a smile. It didn't reach his eyes, but she knew, with absolute certainty, that for Dante Moretti, it was more than enough. His hand closed over the key, and in that simple, possessive gesture, her choice was made and accepted.